The thunderous sound of the Indianapolis crowd's applause was still vibrating through the heavy air of the grand ballroom when my father, Robert Harrison, suddenly stopped in the middle of his sentence, his eyes locking onto mine from across the elevated wooden stage, like he had completely forgotten what words were supposed to come out of his mouth next. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath in that singular, suspended moment of awkwardness. Polished crystal glasses filled with sparkling cider hovered inches away from people's lips, caught in midair. Then he forced a smile that looked tight and practiced, a mask of paternal warmth he had worn for decades, and he said to the hundreds of onlookers, "And my youngest daughter, well, she is here with us tonight. Let's give her a hand, folks." Even in that supposed moment of recognition, he did not actually say my name. He never did. That was the precise moment when a voice from the shadows behind me cut through the heavy, expectant silence, sounding incredibly calm and absolutely certain. "Sir," the man said, his voice carrying through the rafters of the Civic Center, "your daughter's name is already etched on that wall of honor." Every head in the massive, dimly lit room turned toward the back at once, a wave of collective curiosity washing over the tables. I had known deep in my gut that this night would be incredibly uncomfortable from the very second I parked my car in the rain-slicked lot and saw the massive banners hanging outside the Indianapolis Civic Center. The gold lettering on the navy cloth shimmered under the streetlights, announcing the Lifetime Community Achievement Award. My father's name, Robert Harrison, was stretched across the grand entrance in a way that made it seem like he owned the entire structure. Inside the lobby, everything smelled faintly of lemon-scented polish and coffee, the bitter kind that is poured into silver urns at 5 in the afternoon and left to burn for hours on end. The usual utilitarian folding chairs of the Civic Center had been replaced for the evening by large, round tables draped in heavy white linen that reached the floor. There were elaborate centerpieces consisting of small American flags and flickering votive candles that danced and wavered whenever someone walked past the table. I checked in at the registration table near the front doors and took my plastic name badge without bothering to correct the elderly volunteer when she smiled and said, "You're with the family, right, dear?" I simply gave her a small, noncommittal nod. In this town, I was always with the family. I was rarely named, rarely introduced with any specificity, and mostly just present as an accessory to a larger narrative. I chose a seat near the back of the ballroom, close enough to see the brightly lit stage, but far enough away that I wouldn't be in anyone's direct path. That had been my designated role for the vast majority of my life. I had learned to stay visible enough to be considered polite, but invisible enough that I wouldn't complicate the clean lines of my father's public image. Robert liked clean lines, simple and direct narratives, and a son who followed in his footsteps without hesitation. He liked a daughter who made him proud by fitting into the expected mold of Indianapolis society. And then there was me, the youngest child, the one whose path had bent away from his like a river that stubbornly refused to be up or diverted. The room filled up quickly as the start time approached. Men in expensive dark suits shook hands with the same practiced, toothy smiles they had worn at these functions for 30 years. Women adjusted their pearl necklaces and whispered hushed updates to one another about their grades or their recent knee replacements. A few older veterans in the crowd wore ball caps stitched with unit names and the specific years they had served in various conflicts. They nodded at one another in passing, a silent and unspoken language of shared history passing between them in the crowded room. I returned those nods almost without thinking about it. Some old habits don't fade away just because you finally decide to take off the uniform and return to civilian life. My brother, Jackson, arrived to a flurry of polite applause, already working the room with the same effortless charisma our father had taught him since he was a boy. He gave firm, lingering handshakes, maintained steady and intense eye contact, and let out laughter at exactly the right volume to be heard but not appear garish. He looked exactly like Robert had at that age, possessing the same broad shoulders and the same confident, almost arrogant tilt of the chin. My sister followed closely behind him, looking graceful and perfectly composed in a dark emerald dress. Her smile was practiced, but radiated a warmth that made people feel chosen. She leaned in and kissed Robert on the cheek, straightening his silk tie with a tender hand before she took her reserved seat near the front of the stage. He beamed at her with an unfiltered pride that lit up his entire face. He always did that when entered a room. No one really noticed when I slipped my phone into my purse and sat a little in my chair as the house lights finally dimmed. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the stage, his voice booming with authority through the professional sound system as he began to list my father's extensive accomplishments. He spoke of decades of service to the various town committees, the numerous funds he had personally chaired, and the metaphorical bridges he had built between organizations that rarely agreed on anything except for the value of his name. Each listed achievement landed with a fresh wave of applause from the loyal crowd. I clapped my hands too, though my movements were measured and quiet compared to the enthusiasm around me. Then my father stood up to accept the award. Time has a peculiar way of rearranging a man's features without ever asking for his permission to do so. His hair had thinned significantly over the last few years, but his posture was still as rigid as a piece of rebar, his shoulders squared like he was bracing himself against a heavy wind that no one else in the room could feel. He adjusted the microphone stand, cleared his throat with a dry rasp, and smiled out at the crowd of people who had gathered to celebrate his life's work. I had seen that exact smile my entire life. It was the specific one he used when he was absolutely certain of his place in the hierarchy of the room. He thanked the award committee for their consideration. He thanked the local sponsors who had made the banquet possible. He thanked the entire town of Indianapolis for being his home. Then, finally, he turned his attention to thanking his family. "My son Jackson," he said, turning slightly toward my brother, "who followed me directly into this difficult work and carries the very values I have tried to live by every single day." The applause swelled in the room until it was almost deafening. Jackson stood up and waved to the crowd, his performance of humility just well enough executed to be convincing to the people who didn't know him well. "And my oldest daughter," Robert continued, his eyes softening with an obvious affection, "who has always made me so incredibly proud to be her father," rose from her seat, looking elegant and perfectly composed, and the applause returned to the room, sounding warm and approving. Then my father's gaze shifted across the tables. It eventually found me where I sat near the back, my face half lost in the long shadows cast by the pillars. He hesitated for just a heartbeat, a pause long enough for me to notice the gears turning, just long enough for the old, familiar ache to stir in the center of my chest. "And my youngest daughter," he said finally, his voice sounding careful and slightly distant, "who is here with us tonight. Let's give her a hand." A few people in the back clapped tentatively. Some people looked around the room, appearing genuinely unsure of who exactly he was referring to in his speech. Others followed the direction of his eyes and turned in their chairs toward me, their polite smiles forming on their faces as if on a predetermined cue. I stood up because it seemed like the expected thing to do in that environment, gave a single, short nod, and then sat back down as quickly as possible. My name never actually crossed his lips during the entire introduction. It never had at events like this. Names carry a certain amount of weight and history. He simply preferred not to lift the weight of mine in public. As I lowered myself back into my chair, I felt the familiar, cold tightening in my stomach. It wasn't exactly anger, and it certainly wasn't a surprise. It was just a quiet, somber confirmation of something I had known for many years. This was how he kept his narrative tidy and uncomplicated, by acknowledging my physical presence without ever actually defining who I was, and by including me in the family count without ever truly claiming me as his own. That was the exact moment when the voice spoke up from the row behind me. It wasn't a loud shout. It didn't need to be loud to command attention. It carried that rare kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty and respect, not from mere volume. "Sir," the man said, addressing the man on the stage, "your daughter's name is already on that wall." For a long heartbeat, no one in the room moved. Then, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air. Conversations that had been whispered died mid-sentence. Heads turned as one collective unit toward the long, polished wall to the left of the stage, where a series of commemorative plaques and illuminated glass panels had been arranged as part of the evening's historical display. I hadn't paid much attention to them when I first arrived in the rain. I hadn't felt the need to look at them. Now, every single eye in the Civic Center was fixed on that wall. I stayed seated, my hands still folded tightly in my lap, my pulse remaining steady despite the sudden and violent shift in the room's gravity. I didn't need to turn my head to know exactly what they were seeing. I had seen it earlier that evening, quite quietly, before the hall had filled with the smell of coffee and perfume. I had stood there alone for a moment, reading the names and the letters I hadn't expected anyone else in Indianapolis to notice. On the stage, my father turned his body slowly, a look of deep confusion pulling at his aged features as he followed the collective line of sight away from himself. The applause that had dominated the room minutes ago had vanished completely. In its place was a silence so thick and heavy that it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. For the very first time that night, Robert Harrison didn't know what came next in the script, and honestly, neither did anyone else in the room. When you grow up learning not to expect your own name to be called, you eventually stop listening for it entirely. You learn to read the energy of rooms instead. You learn to interpret faces, the length of pauses, and the subtle, nearly invisible shift when someone decides whether you matter enough to be specific about. I had learned that particular skill very early in life, long before the Army's uniforms and ranks had taught me the value of discipline. I had learned it at our old kitchen table in the house on the north side, where my father would say, "Kids," when he was specifically talking to Jackson, and he would say, "You," when he was forced to address me. He never did it with an overt sense of cruelty. That would have actually been much easier for a child to understand. He did it with a cold, corporate efficiency. It was the way a man trims a story down to what he considers to be the essential elements. Names complicate things. Names invite unwanted questions, and I was always the specific question he preferred not to have to answer. I was the youngest child by a full 8 years, an unplanned afterthought born into a family that was already firmly set in its ways and routines. By the time I arrived on the scene, my father's daily routines were fixed, and his expectations for his children were already assigned. My brother, Jackson, was his constant shadow, following him to endless committee meetings and learning the rhythmic flow of local politics and business dinners before he hit puberty. My sister was his walking proof that he could raise a strong, independent woman without ever letting her stray too far from the center line of the family's path. I was different from them from the very start, quieter, more internal, and stubborn in a way that didn't feel the need to announce itself to the world. As a young child, I noticed the small things that other people in our house overlooked. I noticed the way my father's jaw would tighten like a vice when I asked questions that didn't have neat, one-sentence answers. I noticed the way he spoke about duty and the Harrison legacy as if they were paved roads with only one acceptable direction for travel. When I was 10 years old, I told him I wanted to leave Indianapolis someday just to see what else the world had to offer. He looked at me with a bewildered expression, as if I had just suggested we tear down the family home for fun. "People around here don't leave," he told me firmly. "They build." By the time I turned 13, I had fully understood that what he actually meant was that people build exactly where they are told to build. My mother, Sarah, tried her best to soften the hard edges of his personality. She was incredibly good at that. She was an expert at smoothing over the rough spots and filling the heavy silences of our house with a genuine warmth. She would call me by my full name, saying it slowly and deliberately, as if she were carefully stitching it into the air so that it could never be erased or forgot. "Say it proud," she used to whisper to me while she brushed my hair. Names are anchors in a storm. But even with all her grace, she couldn't make him use my name when it mattered most to the public. At various school events or sports banquets, he would introduce my brother as my boy and my sister as my oldest. When it was finally my turn to be acknowledged, he would simply gesture vaguely in my general direction. "And this one," he would say, already turning his body away to talk to someone more important. People would smile politely, give a little nod, and move on with their evening. I learned very early not to try to correct him in those moments. Correcting Robert Harrison only made him dig his heels in deeper and retreat further into his own narrative. The first real fracture in our relationship came during the humid summer I turned 18. Jackson was already working full-time alongside Dad, learning the intricacies of the trade and absorbing the town's unspoken rules of power. Was preparing to head off to an Ivy League college, her entire future already mapped out in a series of bullet points and carefully scheduled donor luncheons. I stood in the heavy oak doorway of my father's study and told him with a voice that didn't tremble that I had decided to enlist in the United States Army. He didn't shout at me, he didn't even try to argue his point. He simply looked up from the papers on his desk and said, "That is not our path." "I know," I answered him, my heart hammering in my chest but my posture remaining firm. I'd practiced that part in the mirror for weeks. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound heavy with a disappointment that felt like a physical weight. "You are just running away from your responsibilities here," he told me. "I am choosing something for myself for the first time," I countered. That was the very first time I saw him choose silence as a form of active punishment. For several weeks leading up to my departure for basic training, he spoke to me only when it was absolutely necessary for household logistics, and he never once addressed me by name. On the morning I finally left for the airport, he stood at the end of the long concrete driveway with his hands buried in his pockets and simply said, "Be careful." He didn't say, "I'm proud of you." He didn't say, "Please come back to us safe." It was just two words, efficient, clinical, and final. From that morning on, my life became a series of places where names actually mattered. I moved through roll calls where you were expected to answer with a sharp, clear voice that left no room for doubt. I saw orders signed in permanent ink and casualty lists that turned people's names into heavy weights you carried in your soul long after the paper was folded up and tucked away. In the military, names weren't an optional accessory, they were the primary form of accountability. Every promotion I earned came with a formal ceremony where my name was read. Every new assignment I received began with a commanding officer reading my name aloud to a room full of strangers. Sometimes they would stumble over the pronunciation, and sometimes they would get the middle initial wrong. I corrected them gently every time, always gently. I had learned through the years the high cost of letting your own name be mishandled or ignored. At home in Indianapolis, nothing ever really changed. The letters I received from my father were rare, typed, and incredibly brief. He would ask about the logistics of my housing or my timelines for leave, anything that kept real emotion at a safe bay. When he spoke about me to his friends or colleagues in the town, he would simply say, "She is doing her thing." He spoke as if my entire life were a minor hobby that he didn't quite understand, but was willing to tolerate from a significant distance. My mother passed away while I was stationed overseas on a deployment. I flew home for the funeral on a series of transport planes, jet-lagged, exhausted, and feeling completely hollowed out by the loss. At the memorial service, my father stood stiffly beside me as a line of people offered their condolences for our loss. More than once, I heard him tell a stranger, "This is my daughter." He never bothered to specify which one. I didn't try to correct him that day. Grief has a way of rearranging your priorities, and names seemed like a very small thing in the face of death. Afterward, however, the old patterns returned to the house with a vengeance. He never asked about the specifics of my work unless it intersected with something he could easily explain to his golf buddies. He never once visited me on the various bases where I was stationed. And at public gatherings like this Civic Center banquet, he kept me safely undefined in his public remarks. So when he paused on that stage tonight, searching his brain for a way to acknowledge me without having to say my name, I wasn't at all surprised. I was disappointed, yes, and I was certainly tired of the game, but I wasn't surprised. What truly surprised me was the interruption from the back of the room. As the silence in the ballroom stretched out to an uncomfortable length, and every single eye in the room became fixed on that far wall, I finally turned my body in my chair and looked. The display was simple and elegant, consisting of rows of names etched into brushed metal and softly illuminated from behind. It was a tribute honoring service, sacrifice, and the various contributions made quietly over many years rather than loudly in political speeches. I knew exactly where my name was on that wall. I knew the specific font and the precise spacing as well as I knew my own reflection in a mirror. I watched my father's face as the realization slowly dawned on him, watching as his confusion gave way to something that looked like profound unease. He hadn't expected this particular part of the family story to be made visible to his peers. He hadn't planned for the community narrative to expand beyond his direct control. Behind me, the man who had spoken remained standing, his hands clasped firmly behind his back in a patient stance. He didn't point his finger. He didn't offer any further explanation. He simply allowed the truth to occupy the physical space it had always deserved. And for the very first time in my 30 years of life, my name was about to be read aloud in a room that my father could not command into silence. I didn't stand up or make a scene when they started reading the names off the wall. I stayed exactly where I was, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap, and my breathing remained steady and rhythmic. Years of military training had taught me the immense value of total stillness in high-pressure situations. Movement draws unwanted attention and can be seen as a sign of weakness. Stillness, however, lets the gravity of the moment do its own work. the plaque wasn't designed to be flashy or over the top. There was no dedicated spotlight on it, no scrolling digital graphics, just the brushed metal and the clean, black lettering arranged by category of service rather than by perceived importance. There were sections for service and sacrifice, community endowments, and veteran support, with names etched with the kind of permanence that doesn't ask for permission to exist. I'd walked past that wall earlier that evening before the room had filled with people, when the rows of chairs were still mostly empty and the air still smelled of fresh lemon polish. I had stopped there without really meaning to, reading the names the way you would read a headstone, not out of a sense of pride, but for the sake of simple. My name was there, printed in full, spelled correctly, with no abbreviations or qualifiers to diminish it. Seeing it in that formal setting had felt strange, like spotting yourself in the background of a photograph you don't even remember posing for. It wasn't because I hadn't earned the right to be there, but because I had never actually needed my service to exist out loud for other people to see. I hadn't come to the banquet tonight expecting any kind of recognition for my life's work. I had come simply because my father had sent me a formal invitation, and because I knew that declining would have turned into a dramatic story of its own that I didn't want to fuel. I had come to sit quietly in the back, clap politely for the speakers, and leave as early as was socially acceptable. The wall, however, had entirely different plans for the evening. As hushed murmurs began to ripple through the crowd like waves, my thoughts began to drift backward in time. I wasn't thinking about my childhood in Indianapolis this time, but about the years of my life I had built entirely without his approval hovering over my head. I had enlisted at the age of 19 with nothing but a single duffel bag and a spine full of stubborn resolve. Basic training had quickly stripped away any lingering illusions I had about what it meant to be tough. The heat of the Georgia summer had pressed down on us like a physical weight you couldn't escape. Harsh voices barked orders that left absolutely no room for hesitation or self-doubt. You learned very quickly in that environment that excuses simply didn't travel well. Either you did the work required of you, or you didn't. Either you showed up every single day, or you disappeared into the anonymous background. I always showed up. I wasn't necessarily the loudest person in the platoon, and I wasn't always the fastest runner. But I was remarkably consistent. I learned how to take thorough notes while other soldiers were complaining about the cold or the food. I learned how to listen with intent before I ever opened my mouth to speak. I learned that true leadership wasn't about being seen at the front of the formation. It was about being completely reliable when no one was watching your every move. My assignments came and went over the years, and the various bases began to blur together in my memory. There were thousands of early mornings and late nights that were stitched into a grueling rhythm that carried me through the kind of years that most people in Indiana only ever saw on the nightly news. I learned how to move massive amounts of people and vital supplies across entire continents without any drama or fanfare. I learned how to read a room full of exhausted, dirty faces and know instinctively when to push them harder and when to let them have a moment to breathe. I learned how to write the kind of letters that would be read through a haze of tears and held on to as a lifeline for the rest of someone's life. There were certainly moments in my career that made the national headlines, and many more moments that never would. There was a vital convoy that was rerouted just in time to avoid disaster. There was a distress call that was answered before it could even ring twice. There were dozens of decisions made quietly that kept a small problem from ballooning into a major catastrophe. None of it was glamorous work, but all of it was absolutely necessary. When my mother, Sarah, fell ill with the cancer, I couldn't always find a way to come home to Indianapolis. I sent money back home instead. It wasn't large sums of cash at first, just enough to cover the small gaps in their insurance that she never bothered to mention in her weekly letters. Later, when her medical care became much more complicated and expensive, I coordinated various military and civilian resources the way I always did, methodically and without making a fuss. My father never once asked how those specialized bills were being paid for. I never felt the need to tell him. After she passed away, I kept doing the only thing I knew how to do. I established a small, private community fund in her name, one that helped local families navigate the same confusing medical and financial maze we had stumbled through together. It grew slowly over the years, supported by a network of people who didn't feel the need to have their names announced at flashy banquets. Veterans contributed to the fund, as did military spouses and a few quiet donors who truly understood that dignity doesn't require a spotlight to be real. The work expanded over time to include housing initiatives, emergency financial assistance, and counseling services for families who didn't know where else to turn until it was almost too late. I served on the boards of these organizations, often attending meetings via secure lines from half a world away, and I signed the checks without ever attaching my personal story to them. It wasn't a matter of keeping secrets, it was simply a matter of preference. I had no interest in the sound of applause. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me now, as I sat in a room that was literally built for the purpose of celebration. My father, Robert, thrived in spaces exactly like this one. He truly believed that a man's impact had to be visible and public to be considered real. He believed that if people didn't stand up and clap for you, then the work you did didn't actually count for anything. I had learned the exact opposite truth over my career. Some of the most meaningful and life-changing work in this world happens in small rooms with no audience at all. On the brightly lit stage, the master of ceremonies cleared his throat with a nervous rasp, glancing back and forth between the names on the wall and my father, clearly unsure of how he was supposed to proceed with the program. My father's mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. He looked significantly smaller to me somehow, his armor of certainty punctured by something he hadn't planned for in his remarks. "Ladies and," the MC said carefully, his voice dropping into a more serious tone, "the display you see on the wall behind you highlights a few individuals whose contributions to this community have spanned several decades. Some of these names are well known to all of us in Indianapolis, while others chose to serve their country and this town quite quietly." A few more people in the front rows shifted in their seats, craning their necks to try and read the metal plates. "This particular name," the MC continued, gesturing toward the section of the wall that was now drawing the most intense attention, "appears under multiple categories of honor: military service, community endowment, and veteran support." My father's head turned as he followed the man's hand toward the plaque. I watched as his broad shoulders tensed up. I could practically imagine the frantic calculations racing through his mind in that silence. How had this happened without his knowledge? Who had taken it upon themselves to put my name there? What did it mean for the tidy, simple story he had just finished telling the room? The truth of the matter was actually very simple. He hadn't known about my work because he had never once bothered to ask me about it. He hadn't seen the plaques because he had never truly looked at me as an individual. As the master of ceremonies paused for a moment, letting the entire room absorb what it was seeing, I felt a strange and powerful calm settle over my entire body. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, and it wasn't a feeling of vindication. It was just a sense of alignment. It was the kind of peace that comes when things in the world finally occupy their rightful and deserved places. I thought about all the countless times I had been introduced in this town without even a name. I thought about all the times I had stood at the edge of rooms exactly like this one, clapping my hands politely for others, while my own significant contributions stayed neatly and safely out of sight. I thought about how none of those snubs had ever stopped me from building a life that I truly respected. Whatever happened next in this room, whatever my father chose to say or chose not to say, would never erase that history. The master of ceremonies turned his body back toward the center of the stage, appearing ready to continue with the evening when my father raised his hand slightly. It wasn't a large, commanding gesture like usual, it was just enough to ask for a brief moment of the room's time. His voice, when he finally spoke again, lacked every bit of its earlier ease and polish. He began, then stopped abruptly. The room waited in a breathless silence, and for the very first time in his public life, he had absolutely no script to lean on for support. My father stood there on the stage with his hand half raised in the air, the professional microphone humming softly in the space between his words. He had commanded rooms exactly like this one for many years: school boards, massive fundraising dinners, tense town halls, where everyone in the crowd knew exactly when it was time to clap and when it was time to stay quiet. This room, however, had suddenly slipped its leash. The attention of the audience had shifted violently away from him, pulled by the quiet and undeniable authority of a metal wall that didn't need his permission to tell the truth. The master of ceremonies lowered his leather-bound notes, appearing deeply uncertain of his next move. A few people in the middle tables leaned forward in their chairs, trying to catch a better glimpse of the wall. Others twisted around in their seats completely, their eyes scanning the brushed metal panels, as if the names might somehow rearrange themselves under intense scrutiny. Names that had once blended into the background of the Civic Center suddenly carried an immense weight. I finally stood up from my chair, not because anyone had asked me to do so, but because it finally felt like the right moment to claim my own posture in this room. The sound of chairs creaking filled the air as people adjusted their positions, tracking my every movement as I stood. I didn't wave to the crowd. I didn't offer a smile. I simply rose to my full height and turned my body slightly, allowing those sitting closest to see my face, and allowing those farther away to finally connect the face with the name they were reading on the wall. Hushed whispers began to ripple through the ballroom like wind moving through tall Indiana grass. "That's her, I had no idea who he meant. Did you know she had served all those years?" My brother Jackson looked back at me from his front row seat, then really looked at me, confusion knitting his brow into a tight knot. He didn't look angry. He looked completely disoriented, as if a familiar map of his world had been redrawn while he wasn't paying attention. My sister's expression shifted to one of pure surprise first, then to something much quieter. Maybe it was respect, or at least a new kind of recognition. On the elevated stage, my father cleared his throat once again. The sound echoed far too loudly in the heavy silence of the Civic Center. He glanced at the MC, then at the wall of names, then finally back at me. His eyes searched my face with a desperation, the way a man looks for a door he's absolutely certain used to be there, but has since vanished. "Was not aware," he said at last, his voice sounding measured and brittle, as if he were choosing each individual word like it might break into pieces if handled carelessly, "of the extent of all of this." The master of ceremonies gave a small nod, appearing visibly relieved to finally have something solid to respond to in the script. "Many of our honorees prefer to keep it that way, Robert," he said gently to the room. "Their work often speaks for itself far more clearly than a speech ever could." A few people in the crowd chuckled softly at the remark, though the laughter wasn't unkind. The tension in the ballroom eased just enough for people to feel like they could breathe again. My father shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the confident, broad-shouldered stance he had carried all evening finally faltering. He reached up and adjusted the microphone stand again, then let his hand fall limply to his side. For a long moment, I thought he might try to retreat back into his comfortable platitudes, thank everyone for coming again, make a quick joke to break the ice, and move on. That was always his primary instinct when things grew uncomfortable or off-script. Instead, he did something that was entirely unexpected. He took a step away from the podium and the microphone. The movement was small in scale, but felt massive and decisive. It pulled the entire room's focus back to him without him having to demand it. He turned his body fully toward the wall, squinting his eyes slightly as he began to read the names and the categories. I watched his face change in real time as the recognition settled in piece by painful piece. It wasn't a recognition of abstract achievement. He had always understood achievement in a clinical way. It was a recognition of effort, of duration, and of scale. "How long?" he asked. He didn't speak into the microphone, but he said it aloud, as if the room itself might provide him with the answer he needed. "Several years," the MC replied from the side of the stage. "Some of these specific contributions go back more than a full decade." My father nodded his head slowly, the movement heavy. The man who had built his entire life on the tracking of timelines and the hitting of major milestones was clearly recalibrating his reality, realizing exactly how much time had passed in his own house without his notice. He turned his body back toward the large audience then, and finally, he looked back at me. The physical distance between us felt suddenly vast and impossible to cross, not a distance measured in feet or rows of tables, but in decades of unasked questions and ignored truths. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice much softer now, almost a whisper that didn't need the speakers to be heard. I met his gaze from the back of the room and spoke for the very first time that evening, my voice remaining steady and, "You didn't ask." The words weren't delivered with a sharp edge. They didn't need to be sharp to cut. They landed in the room anyway, hitting their target with a heavy thud. A collective intake of breath moved through the ballroom like a ghost. Someone sitting near the front of the stage shifted uncomfortably in their chair. This wasn't at all the kind of polite exchange that people came for at award dinners in Indianapolis. There was no script for a moment of raw, family honesty. There was no cue for polite applause to signal the next transition in the evening. My father's mouth tightened for a second, then relaxed into a look of defeat. He nodded his head once, accepting the correction without any further comment. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat again, trying to regain control. Perhaps, he offered carefully, his eyes darting between us, we could hear a few words from the general's daughter. He glanced at me, waiting for a response. I stepped forward from my seat before he could even finish the sentence, moving toward the center aisle and the stage with the same measured, rhythmic pace I had learned long ago on the parade deck. Each step felt incredibly deliberate and grounded. I didn't rush my movements, and I didn't hesitate for a second. When I finally reached the podium on the stage, I didn't bother to adjust the microphone height. I didn't feel like I needed it to be heard. I rested my hands lightly on the polished edge of the wood and looked out over the sea of faces turned toward me. Some of the expressions were curious, some were embarrassed by the intimacy of the moment, and some were openly moved by the turn of events. I didn't come here tonight to be recognized for anything, I said to the silent crowd. I came here to honor my father. A low murmur of surprise moved through the tables. The work that you see etched on that wall wasn't done for the sake of applause or for banquets like this, I continued, my voice gaining strength. It was done simply because it needed to be done, because true service doesn't always feel the need to announce itself to the world. Sometimes, service just shows up day after day, year after year, in the quiet hope that it made a small difference in someone's life. I paused for a beat, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. My father taught me the immense value of building something that lasts, I said, turning my body slightly toward him, even if we didn't always agree on the exact way to do that. He held my gaze, something unreadable and ancient passing between us in that space. I am truly grateful to the people on the committee who chose to acknowledge that work, I finished, and I am glad that it can finally stand here tonight without the need for further explanation. I took a step back from the podium, returning the stage to him without any further ceremony. For a long heartbeat, not a single person in the Civic Center moved. Then a man sitting near the back row began to clap, slowly at first. Then another person joined in. The sound began to build, not into a sudden crash of thunderous applause, but into something much steadier and more respectful. Veterans in the crowd straightened up in their seats. A woman sitting near the center aisle dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. The applause wasn't for the spectacle of a family drama. It was for the sake of understanding. My father stood perfectly still as the sound washed over both of us on the stage. When the applause finally faded away into the rafters, he returned to the microphone, his voice sounding different now, less polished, more gravelly, and far more real. My youngest daughter, he said, and this time he didn't rush past the words to get to the next point. He looked directly at me and said, "She has done so much more than I ever knew." He stopped speaking right there. There were no excuses offered, no qualifiers added to soften the blow, just a simple, honest sentence allowed to stand on its own. And for the very first time in that civic center, my name didn't feel like an omission. The applause didn't crash down on the room all at once this time. It rolled in slowly, in waves that felt uneven and cautious, as if the people in the room were testing the air to see whether they were actually allowed to respond at all. I stood exactly where I was, my hands resting at my sides, letting the sound pass over me without reaching out to claim it. Applause can feel like a powerful tide. If you step into it too eagerly or with too much pride, you can very easily lose your footing. I had absolutely no interest in slipping now. My father remained standing at the podium, his fingers curled tightly around the wooden edge. He nodded his head once, not to the crowd of onlookers, but to himself. The nod carried the visible weight of a man, finally realizing that he had been completely overtaken by a story he thought he was the one telling. The MC hovered just a few feet away, looking ready to step in at any moment if things started to unravel. No one in the leadership wanted a scene at the Liberty Civic Center. No one wanted to admit that a significant scene had already taken place. When the room finally settled back into a low hum, my father cleared his throat again. This time, the sound didn't feel like a performance for the crowd. It sounded tired. "I have spent a very long time believing that I fully understood my family," he said to the room, "believing that I knew exactly where each of my children was supposed to fit into the plan." He paused for a moment, his eyes moving briefly to Jackson, then too. They both sat very still in the front row now, their earlier confidence softened by a thick layer of uncertainty. Jackson's hands were clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone completely pale. Stared straight ahead at the stage, her practiced smile long gone, replaced by something deeply thoughtful and strained. I spoke tonight the way I have spoken for many years, my father continued, speaking in generalities and in summaries. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. This was entirely unfamiliar territory for Robert Harrison, a moment of public self-examination. He shifted his stance on the stage, his shoulders sagging just a fraction, as if he were acknowledging the force of gravity for the first time in his life. I see now that I left many important things out of the narrative, he said. Not just someone or her, but things. It was as close as he could possibly get in that public moment to an admission of his failure. I felt the old, ingrained instinct rise up in me, the urge to stay quiet, to let him move past this awkwardness the way he always did in the past. Silence had been my primary shield for most of my adult life. It had kept arguments from igniting and kept disappointments from spreading like a fire. But silence, as I had learned the hard way, also lets misunderstandings and resentment fossilize until they are part of the structure. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced myself to speak again, my voice sounding incredibly calm even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Even silence can be a useful tool in the right circumstances, I said, the words projecting clearly through the still air of the Civic Center ballroom. But I have also learned that silence can serve to protect and fossilize the wrong version of the truth. Every single head in the room turned toward me again, the collective attention shifting like a physical weight. I didn't raise my voice or shout for attention. I didn't feel like I needed to. I had learned through years of command that authority doesn't require volume. I stayed quiet for a very long time because I didn't want to cause any embarrassment for anyone in this room. I continued, my gaze steady on the people at the tables. I didn't want to embarrass my father, and I certainly didn't want to embarrass my family during their big night. But I have finally come to understand that staying quiet is not the same thing as disappearing from the story entirely. The words I spoke felt measured and deliberate, like heavy stepping stones being placed one by one across a stretch of deep, dark water. My father stood on that stage and listened to me. He really listened for the first time in my life, his jaw working as he processed the gravity of what I was saying. The entire room seemed to wait with him, caught in that uncomfortable but necessary space between public discomfort and the relief of a truth finally being told. This wasn't some dramatic, made-for-television scene. This was a long overdue correction of a family's history. My brother, Jackson, stood up then with a sudden jerky movement, his chair scraping loudly and harshly against the polished wooden floor. He looked at me for a long moment from the front row, then he turned his head and looked up at our father on the stage. I honestly didn't know, Jackson said, his voice sounding tight and strained. I mean, I obviously knew you were serving in the army, but I had absolutely no idea about any of that work on the wall. I never felt the need to advertise my work, Jackson, I replied to him. My voice was devoid of any accusation, it was just a statement of fact. And you never bothered to ask me about it. I watched a flicker of genuine shame wash across his face before he slowly sat back down in his linen-draped chair. My sister followed his lead a moment later, rising to her feet with a bit more grace and composure. She didn't look at the crowd, she kept her eyes locked on mine. I should have asked you too, she said quietly. I'm so sorry. I met her eyes and gave her a single, slow nod of, that was enough for now. My father watched this entire exchange from his position at the podium, something heavy and unreadable settling deep behind his eyes. He gripped the edges of the microphone stand for a moment, then he let his hands fall limply to his sides. I thought I was doing the right thing by protecting the family, he said, his voice carrying a new vulnerability. I thought keeping things simple was the best way to move forward. Simple isn't always the same thing as being honest, Dad, I said. The ballroom was so quiet now that I could actually hear the low, electrical hum of the overhead lights. No one in the audience shifted in their seats. No one whispered to their neighbor. This was the specific moment that everyone in Indianapolis would remember when they talked about the Harrison Achievement dinner years later. They wouldn't remember the exact wording of the award or the quality of the chicken dinner. They would remember this strange, sober reckoning that had unfolded in front of them without any shouting or theatrical tears. My father turned his body fully toward me now, standing at the very edge of the stage. For a long, suspended second, we simply looked at one another from across the expanse of the room. It felt like 30 years of distance were being compressed into the narrow space between breaths. Say your name, he said suddenly. The request actually startled me for a second. It wasn't because I didn't know the answer, but because he had never once asked me to say it in a public setting before. Names had always been something he managed, something he controlled, or to keep his narratives tidy. Asking me to say it felt like a total surrender of that control. I didn't hesitate for more than a heartbeat. "My name is Harrison," I said, speaking it clearly and firmly. I said it with the same sharp precision I had used in countless morning roll calls, in high-stakes briefings, and in those heavy moments that demanded absolute accountability. The sound of my full name filled the ballroom, sounding anchored and complete. My father repeated it after me, much slower this time, as if he were testing the physical weight of the syllables in his mouth. They seemed to sit awkwardly on his tongue at first, but then they settled. "There," he said, giving a small, weary nod. "I should have been saying that name all along." No burst of applause followed his statement this time. None was actually needed. The truth had finally landed cleanly in the center of the room, and there was no going back. The master of ceremonies stepped forward gently, sensing the shift in the room's energy and knowing it was time to transition. "Thank you," he said, "for sharing that perspective with us tonight." He turned his head back toward my father, offering him the stage again. "Robert, please continue with your remarks." My father returned to the podium, but his entire posture had changed. The rigid, arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a softer, more human presence. The rest of his acceptance speech was significantly shorter than the draft I'm sure he had prepared. It was stripped of its usual corporate polish and political fluff. He thanked the committee again, offered a brief word to the town, and concluded without any of his usual flourishes. The formal award presentation followed immediately after. The plaque was handed over, and the official photographs were taken with the sponsors. Polite applause rose and fell through the room, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered. The formalities of the evening resumed, but everyone knew the room was different now. People started approaching me quietly as the official program ended and the house lights came up. Veterans I had never met shook my hand with a firm, lingering grip that spoke of a shared understanding. A woman I didn't recognize pressed her hand against my arm and whispered, "Your mother would be so incredibly proud of you tonight." I thanked her, the words catching just slightly in the back of my throat. My father watched all of this from a distance, the heavy award plaque tucked under his arm, his expression remaining unreadable. He didn't try to approach me right away. As the crowd finally began to thin out and the catering staff started scraping chairs back into place, I felt a strange, steady calm wash over me. It was the feeling that follows a necessary storm. I hadn't come to this banquet with the intention of upending my father's life or ruining his achievement. I hadn't even planned to speak to the crowd. But the truth had insisted on claiming its own place in the room tonight. And now it stood there, undeniable and firm, no longer protected or constrained by the silence I had worn like a cloak for 3 decades. The crowd thinned out the way it always does after these formal events, slowly at first, and then all at once as people realized they had families of their own to get back to. Programs were folded up and tucked into leather purses. Conversations resumed in low, careful tones, as if people weren't quite sure what volume was appropriate after witnessing such an intimate family moment. The small band in the corner began packing up their instruments, the soft, rhythmic clink of metal stands echoing faintly across the hollow hall. I stepped away from the stage area and moved toward the side of the ballroom, needing a little bit of physical space to breathe. My pulse had finally settled back to its resting rate, but there was a new heaviness in my chest that hadn't been there when I arrived. It wasn't the heaviness of regret or doubt. It was the weight of something long overdue finally being acknowledged in the light. I didn't look back toward the stage right away. I knew my father would either come to find me or he wouldn't. Either way, I was officially done chasing him across crowded rooms and seeking his approval. I walked out through the heavy ballroom doors and into the lobby, where the air felt significantly cooler and cleaner than it had inside. The lobby smelled of commercial carpet cleaner and faint, expensive perfume, a specific olfactory mix that always reminded me of international airports at odd hours of the night. I stood near a tall, floor-to-ceiling window and watched the cars pull up to the valet and then pull away into the Indiana night, their headlights cutting brief, bright arcs through the darkness. "Hey," a voice said from behind me. It was Jackson. He sounded unsure of himself, stripped of every bit of the confidence he usually wore so easily in public. I turned around to face him. "I really did not know," he said again, rubbing the back of his neck with a frustrated hand. "I mean it, Dad." He never talked about you much. He never mentioned what you were actually doing out there. I know he didn't, Jackson, I said softly. That doesn't make it right, he added quickly, his eyes searching mine. It explains a lot of things about the last 10 years. I nodded my head, accepting his words. Understanding is always a good place to start, even if it comes late. He hesitated for a moment, then he offered me a small, awkward smile that reminded me of when we were children. I'm really proud of you. I should have said that to you a long time ago. Probably a decade ago. I looked at him and felt a small part of the old wall crumble. Thank you, Jackson, I replied. The words felt solid and real between us. He took a step back, giving me my space, and then he disappeared into the crowd of people leaving the building. My sister approached me next. She moved slower than Jackson had, her high heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the tile floor of the lobby. She stopped a few feet away from me and sighed. I think we all played our designated parts for way too long, she said, looking out at the rain. Even when we didn't consciously mean to hurt you, we just followed the script Dad wrote. We usually do follow the scripts we're given until we decide to write our own, I answered. She reached out and squeezed my hand once, a brief but powerful gesture, and then she let go. There were no grand promises of a new relationship, no dramatic scenes of reconciliation, just a quiet, honest of what had been missing. She followed after Jackson, leaving the space between me and the front door empty once again. I stayed there for a moment longer, listening to the hum of the building as it settled into its nighttime routine. Then, I felt a presence rather than heard it. My father was standing a few steps away from me. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long and exhausting march. The award plaque was still tucked under his arm, but his shoulders were slumped in a way I had never seen before. Can we talk for a minute? He asked. I considered the request for a long heartbeat, then I gave a slow nod. Just a minute, Dad. We stepped outside the glass doors together, moving into the cool, damp night air. The parking lot was washed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. The sounds of crickets filled the silence between us, steady and indifferent to our human drama. He leaned his back against a car that wasn't his and stared out at the empty street. I built my entire life on appearances, he said finally, his voice sounding thin. I built it on making sure that everything looked exactly right to the neighbors and the committees. I waited for him to continue. I had learned that silence has its own uses in a negotiation. I thought if I kept things neat and tidy, he continued, if I told the family story a certain way, then it would all hold together. I didn't realize until tonight just how much I was cutting out of that story. I didn't realize I was cutting you out. People don't just disappear from the world just because you refuse to name them, Dad, I said gently. He nodded his head, his eyes fixed on the black asphalt at his feet. I was afraid, he admitted, the honesty of the statement surprising me more than any formal apology could have. I was afraid because you had gone so far beyond what I understood. You were doing things I didn't know how to stand next to. I didn't know how to be the father of a woman like you. I didn't need you to understand every single detail of my life, Dad, I told him. I just needed you to acknowledge that I was living it. He turned his head toward me then, and he really looked at me. His face was lined and tired, stripped of every bit of the pretense he had carried on the stage. I am so sorry I didn't do that, he said. I am sorry it took a wall full of names in a civic center for me to finally see my own daughter. I let the words sit in the air between us. Apologies aren't like coins that you can just spend quickly to make a debt go away. They need to be examined. They need to be weighed for their sincerity. What happens now? He asked, looking at me with a sudden uncertainty. I thought about that question for a long time. I thought about how many stories in the world rush to fix things neatly at the end, to wrap up years of pain in a quick reconciliation and call it closure. Now, I said, we just call things what they actually are. You don't have to try to rewrite the last 30 years, Dad, you just have to stop repeating them. He nodded once, absorbing the weight of that requirement. Your name, he said slowly and deliberately. He said it again, correctly this time, without any of the rushing or the omission he had used for years. Harrison, I won't forget it again. I believed him in that moment. I didn't believe him because he had made a grand promise, but because of the specific, careful way he had spoken it. We stood there together for a moment longer in the Indiana night. We were two people bound together by blood and by time, not suddenly healed or perfectly reconciled, but no longer pretending that the wound wasn't there. That was enough for one night. Inside the Civic Center, the last of the guests were finally leaving the building. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of laughter rising and falling. Life was moving on the way it always does. I turned toward my truck, my car keys feeling cool and solid in my hand. As I drove away from the ballroom, the massive building receded in my mirror, the lights shrinking into the dark horizon. The night stretched open ahead of me, feeling quiet and honest for the first time in a long while. I felt like the story of my life had finally been corrected. It hadn't been rewritten, and it hadn't necessarily been redeemed, but it had been set straight. And sometimes, that is all a lifetime really needs. I drove the entire way back to my house with the radio turned off, letting the rhythmic hum of the tires on the highway fill the space where my thoughts usually raced. The road back was familiar, lined with small storefronts that were already dark and shuttered for the night. These were the same streets I had passed 1,000 times while I was growing up, but everything looked different to me tonight. Everything looked smaller, or maybe I had just finally grown into a different scale of existence. At a long stoplight near the edge of town, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked tired, and my jaw was set, but my shoulders were finally relaxed. I thought about how many thousands of miles it had taken to arrive at a moment that had lasted less than a single hour. I thought about how much invisible work goes into a correction that, once it's finally made, looks so incredibly obvious in hindsight. When I finally reached my own driveway, I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine still running. The house was quiet and dark, with only a single porch light cutting a soft, yellow circle into the gloom. I turned the key in the ignition and listened as the silence of the neighborhood settled deep and clean around me. Inside the house, I set my purse down on the entryway table and kicked off my shoes. The simple, mundane rituals felt grounding after a night that had required me to stand much taller than usual. I poured myself a glass of cold water and stood at the kitchen counter, letting the liquid cool my throat. My phone buzzed on the counter once, and then it buzzed again. I looked down and saw messages from people I hadn't expected to hear from tonight. There were texts from veterans I had served with years ago, a message from a woman I worked with on the housing initiative, and a note from an old colleague who had obviously heard what happened through the kind of quiet channels that don't require public announcements. The notes were all short and steady. "Proud of you, it was about time. You handled that with class." I smiled just a little bit at the screen. Later that night, when the house had settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, the refrigerator clicking on, the distant, muffled bark of a neighbor's dog, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about my father. I didn't think about the man who had stood on the stage earlier tonight, or the voice that had stumbled over his own omissions. I thought about the man who had been standing in the rain-slicked parking lot under the yellow lights, saying my name as if it were something newly discovered and fragile. I didn't expect us to suddenly become something we had never been before. Stories like that belong in the movies, not in real life. What I wanted was something much simpler and more sustainable. I wanted accuracy. I wanted a shared understanding that doesn't require the sound of applause to hold it together. In the days that followed that dinner, my life returned to its usual busy rhythm. My work called for my attention, meetings began to stack up on my calendar, and decisions were waiting to be made. The wall at the Liberty Civic Center stayed exactly where it was, the names etched into the metal and illuminated from behind. It stayed there doing exactly what names are meant to do, marking a presence and honoring a history. My father called me once that week, the conversation brief and careful. He asked me how I was doing. He said my name. It wasn't a dramatic phone call, and it didn't need to be. I visited my mother's grave the following weekend. The grass was trimmed and neat, and the small American flags were fluttering gently in the afternoon breeze. I stood there for a long time, longer than I usually did, with my hands clasped behind my back. I told her exactly what had happened at the Civic Center. I didn't leave out any details. I gave her the whole story. I told her that the correction had finally been made in front of everyone. I told her that her voice, the one that had always insisted that names mattered more than anything else, had been right all along. On the long drive back to my house with the windows rolled down, I thought about how many people in this world carry a version of themselves that never quite gets a name. I thought about how many people sit at the very edge of rooms, applauding for the successes of others, while wondering if the significant work they have done will ever be seen clearly. I thought about the immense cost of staying silent and the equally high cost of speaking up, and how choosing between those two options is rarely a simple task. But here is what I know for certain now. True dignity doesn't require a massive audience, but the truth does require its own space to exist. Sometimes that space opens up quietly and without warning. Sometimes it opens up all at once in front of a room full of people you never planned to teach a lesson to. Either way, when that moment finally comes, you have to be willing to stand in it. You have to be willing to say what needs to be said without sharpening your words into a weapon. You have to let the facts do the heavy lifting for you. My father still has his Lifetime Community Achievement Award. It sits on a prominent shelf in his home where every visitor can see it. The wall at the Civic Center still carries my name in brushed metal. Neither one of those things erases the difficult years that came before them, but together, they tell a story that is much closer to being whole than it has ever been. If you have listened to this story this far, then maybe you are carrying a name around that hasn't been spoken enough in your own life. Maybe you have been doing the hard, invisible work for years without any of the recognition, trusting simply that the work mattered. Regardless of your situation, I hope this story serves as a reminder that quiet strength always counts for something. I hope it reminds you that, when the time finally comes, it is perfectly okay to let the truth be seen by the world. I would truly love to hear what this story brought up for you today. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and tell me where you are listening from. We tell stories like this every single day, stories about dignity, about correction, and about the long, winding roads that eventually lead us back to ourselves. If you want to keep walking that road with us, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We are truly glad that you are here with us. Let's continue this journey together.